HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Said I Wasn't Gonna Tell Nobody, The Making of a Black Theologian, by James H. Cohn, read by Bill Andrew Quinn. Introduction. I resisted writing this book. It is hard to tell the truth about yourself, but the more I tried not to write, the more I felt compelled to write. I thought about Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells Barnett, and Malcolm X. Autobiography is a medium African Americans have chosen to speak to America, from the slave narratives to the present. I felt the need to speak not so much about myself as about Black theology and how it found me and gave me voice. I have tried to tell my story of Black theology as truthfully and forcefully as I know how. The journey has been long, sometimes difficult, but always exciting and empowering. I knew I would be risking a lot to put blackness and faith in conversation, but I had no other choice. I knew faith, but I was just getting acquainted with blackness, and it was disturbing my soul, making me uncomfortable with the faith of the Macedonia AME Church in Bearden, Arkansas. The church where I grew up could not speak to Black power. It was too outrageous, but that is what attracted me to it. Chapter 1. Couldn't keep it to myself. Removing my mask. When the Detroit Rebellion, also known as the 12th Street Riot, broke out in July of 1967, the turmoil woke me out of my academic world. I could no longer continue quietly teaching white students at Adrian College, Michigan, about Karl Barth, Paul Tillich, and other European theologians when Black people were dying in the streets of Detroit, Newark, and the back roads of Mississippi and Alabama. I had to do something, but I wasn't a civil rights leader like Martin Luther King Jr. or an artist like James Baldwin, who was spurred in his writing when he saw the searing image of a Black girl, Dorothy Counts, surrounded by hateful whites as she attempted to integrate a white school in Charlotte, North Carolina, September 1957. I was a theologian, asking, what, if anything, is theology worth in the Black struggle in America? Theology was my trade, all I had to show for nearly 30 years of living. I had a Ph.D. in systematic theology, but I didn't know how to use it in the fight for justice since nothing I'd read spoke about what Black people were going through. I had no models to follow. The few Negroes who had studied theology imitated white theologians, as I'd done, while writing a doctoral dissertation on the Swiss theologian Karl Barth. The Detroit Rebellion deeply troubled me and revolutionized my way of thinking. I could no longer write the same way, following the lead of Europeans and white Americans. I had to find a new way of talking about God that was accountable to Black people and their fight for justice. I was the only Negro professor at a white college in a Midwestern city of about 25,000 people, which included, as far as I could tell, no more than 50 Negroes, including me. I had gone to Adrian, a Negro, during the summer of 1966, and I had tried my best to fit in. Lester B. Scherer, a friend and classmate at Garrett Theological Seminary, now Garrett Evangelical, and Northwestern University, had recommended me, and I didn't want to disappoint him. He had taken a risk, assuring colleagues who'd never had a Negro on their faculty that I was no troublemaker or angry Black militant, and thus would make an excellent hire. Although Stokely Carmichael's proclamation of Black power was the most talked-about subject in the news, I did not talk about race with my neighbors. I kept my cool, trying to be a good Negro. I had a wife and a 4-year-old son, and I didn't want to make our social life impossible. I didn't even talk about race with my progressive colleagues at the college. We talked about our classes in religion, literature, and history, limiting our talk of justice to the escalating war in Vietnam. We marched against the war, incurring strong opposition from the president of the college, a Goldwater Republican, whose son was killed in Vietnam. I couldn't separate the killing of colored people in Vietnam from Negroes in America's cities, a connection Martin Luther King Jr. had made in his great Beyond Vietnam address at Riverside Church in New York on April 4, 1967. But I saw no way of articulating that connection without, like King, expressing deep anger about global racism, thereby threatening relations with my white colleagues. I was also silent about racial issues at the First United Methodist Church I attended. I knew that any talk about racism would be too controversial for white Republican Christians who'd voted for Barry Goldwater and who were eager to show me, with their smiles and general friendliness, that they were nice people with no prejudice against Negroes. In turn, I wanted to show them that I was a Christian Negro with good manners and no resentment against white people. I quietly blended in, participating as a leader in worship and taking young people on weekend retreats for Bible study and play. Of course, I had learned as a child to wear a mask, a disguise I had perfected by the time I moved to Adrian. "We wear the mask that grins and lies," wrote the great Negro poet Paul Laurence Dunbar in a poem I began reciting in grade school. Those words spoke to the experience of Negroes in Arkansas and the South generally, who took great risks in disagreeing with whites. When a Negro expressed an opinion that differed from a white person, the typical response was, "Are you calling me a liar, boy?" No black person would dare contradict a white man or woman, or even a child. In their world, white was always right. Knowing that, we had to disguise our true selves in order to keep a job, stay out of jail, or even stay alive. Got one mind for white folks to see, another for what I know was me. So went a well-known Negro folk song that I often heard as I was growing up. As a child, I learned to wear a mask whenever I went to town in Bearden, careful always not to show my real self, for fear of offending white people. When I was around whites, I was mostly silent, spoke only when spoken to, and showed the deference expected of me, head down, never looking any white person in the eyes, for only uppity niggers would be so bold. I went to the back door of their homes, drank water from colored fountains, addressed whites as Mr. and Mrs., and moved out of their way on the street. I hated what the writer Richard Wright called the ethics of living Jim Crow. But whites were powerful and dangerous, and they could strike without warning. You had to be very careful and watch their every move, lest you unintentionally caused them offense. So I kept my mask on until I got back to Cotton Belt, the name for the black community where I grew up. There I could relax and exhale a bit, safe from the unpredictable reactions of white folk. I took my mask with me to graduate school at Garrett and Northwestern. There, too, I was a good Negro, and for the most part suppressed my rage, with one notable exception. That occurred one day in a class taught by one of my doctoral advisors, Philip S. Watson, a Cambridge-educated Luther scholar and author of Let God Be God, 1947. A staid, short, gray-haired Englishman, he was an excellent advisor, whose office door was always open to me. I was his favorite student, and other students knew it. But one day in 1961, I completely lost control in class. My anger erupted, stunning Watson and everyone else, including my brother, Cecil, who was sitting beside me. At that time, sit-ins and freedom rides were interrupting all over the South. Black and white activists were being beaten bloody, sometimes killed, for advocating the right to eat at lunch counters, ride on integrated interstate buses, or use public bathrooms. White ministers condemned their actions from their pulpits and in the media, calling such activists outside agitators, communists, criminals, and thugs. White theologians, including my advisor and his colleagues, said nothing. They taught as if nothing was happening in the streets of America. My anger had been building for days, months, and even years. I felt that I should be with my brothers and sisters who were actively fighting for black freedom. "Dr. Watson," I interrupted him during a lecture. He stopped and looked at me, obviously irritated. "What is it?" he asked. "You are a racist," I shouted, my voice growing louder. "You have been lecturing for days about the violence of Catholics against Protestants during the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe, and you've said nothing about the violence of white Protestants against blacks in the South today." Looking back, I know I should have found a more respectful way to raise my concern. But black pain runs deep, wide, and long, and there were times when I could not contain my rage. Yet Watson, a recent immigrant from England, living in a white area of Evanston, with no contact with Negroes except 5 or 6 students at Garrett, had no understanding of that. All he knew was what he read and heard in the media, which was grossly inadequate and inaccurate. He paced the floor for a few seconds, which seemed like minutes. The class was silent, and I could feel every eye upon me. I realized immediately what I had done. I had taken off my mask too soon. I was still in graduate school and needed Watson's approval to get my doctorate. Now I had offended him in the worst way. He turned and looked at me with anger in his piercing eyes, then shouted, "That's simply not true. Class dismissed." With that he stormed out of the room and headed toward his office. I followed anxiously behind, wondering whether I had lost him forever, and with him my degree. "Jim, you know I'm not a racist," he said, after we entered his office. "Yes, I know," he replied. "But Dr. Watson, I wasn't really talking about you, even though my words came out that way. I apologize. I was talking about the deeper problem of race in America, which weighs heavy on my soul, making it difficult for me to study and do my best work." Surprisingly, he seemed to recognize what I was wrestling with. He relaxed and his anger subsided. For the first and only time we had a long conversation about race. I put my mask back on and saved my degree. For about a year after joining the faculty at Adrian College, I had done what was expected of a Negro. But then Detroit exploded, and so did I. My explosion shook me at the core of my racial identity, killing the Negro in me and resurrecting my black self. I felt a black fire burning inside me, so hot I couldn't control it any longer. Yet I had to be careful to keep my rage from exploding among my white colleagues and friends. I withdrew and kept to myself, lamenting over the 43 dead and 5 days of Black Rebellion. But I had to find a way to let it out, to express what I was feeling about blackness and whiteness, race and theology. That was when I knew I had to write to let the world know what was stirring in me or lose my sanity. In churches and the news media, white ministers and politicians condemned Black Power as hate speech. They denounced urban uprisings as the work of Negro thugs engaged in criminal activity. Many Negro ministers and civil rights activists agreed. I reacted the same way as James Baldwin, whom I'd been reading since graduate school. Who is looting whom? Grabbing off the TV set? He doesn't really want the TV set. He's saying, "Screw you." He wants to let you know he's there. You are accusing a captive population who has been robbed of everything. I think it's obscene. Martin Luther King Jr. was greatly disturbed about unrest in the cities and the rhetoric of Black Power, which reminded him of the violent language of Malcolm X. I did not share King's view. Black Power expressed what I had been feeling from the time Stokely Carmichael first shouted the phrase in Mississippi in June 1966. Though it challenged King's nonviolent philosophy, I never thought of Black Power in terms of violence and hate. Rather, it expressed the necessity of black people asserting their dignity in the face of 350 years of white supremacy. Black Power simply meant that Negroes were tired of being exploited and humiliated. As a theologian, I felt compelled to write a manifesto to white churches announcing that Negroes could no longer tolerate the violation of their dignity. I had to give voice to the feelings of rage in the Negro community, and especially the rage inside of me. I began rereading Malcolm X for a deeper understanding of Black Power as the response to black self-hate. Malcolm X revolutionized my consciousness, transforming me from a Negro theologian to a black theologian, angry and ready to do battle with white theologians. My newfound blackness impelled me to write, to let the world know that a new voice had arrived on the theological scene. I didn't know I could write. I had never written anything except academic papers about European theologians in graduate school. Black Power, however, was not an academic issue. It was an existential issue about black dignity, the political liberation of black people from white oppression by any means necessary, as Malcolm X had said. Writing about Black Power was different from writing about European theologians. For me, nothing was at stake in European theology. It didn't matter whether Barth or Harnack was right in their debate about the meaning of revelation. I wasn't ready to risk my life for that. Now, with Black Power, everything was at stake. the affirmation of black humanity in a white supremacist world. I was ready to die for black dignity. I was fed up with white theologians writing about the gospel as if it had nothing to do with black power and black people's struggle for cultural identity and political justice. I was fed up with liberal white ministers condemning riots instead of the social conditions that created them. I was fed up with conservative black churches preaching an otherworldly gospel as if Jesus had nothing to say about how white supremacy had created a world that was killing black people. I knew that black power advocates like Stokely Carmichael and militant black ministers like Albert Cleage had no interest in debating white religious scholars or well-schooled white ministers. But I did. It was time for me to join my black brothers and sisters in the fight for justice using what I'd learned in graduate school. It was time to turn the white man's theology against him and make it speak for the liberation of black people. Militant Negro ministers needed a theology that could liberate their minds from any dependence on white theology. Black power is the gospel of Jesus in America today. That was my central theological claim as I reflected on the Detroit Rebellion. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I went to bed thinking about it, got up in the morning thinking about it, and thought about it all day. I was obsessed. It was like a revelation, a sudden bolt from the blue, a fire burning inside me. I didn't say a word to anybody about what I was feeling and thinking. There was nobody I could talk to about it in Adrian, not even my friend Lester Scherer. I simply meditated on the claim for months, examining it over and over again in my mind, thinking about its truth and wondering why I hadn't thought of it before. Then, to my surprise, I boldly asserted it in a theological discussion with white friends from graduate school at the annual meeting of the American Academy of Religion in November 1967. Black power is not the gospel, they replied with great emphasis, nearly in unison. How in the world could you assert such an outrageous, nonsensical idea? Asked Ronald Getz, a well-known scholar of Karl Barth at Garrett and my closest friend in theology. He viewed my claim as an ideological distortion of the gospel. As he saw it, following Barth, who himself was following the great Danish theologian Søren Kierkegaard, God's revelation is wholly other, never ever identified with the ideas and actions of human beings. I understood Getz's concern because I too had studied Barth and Kierkegaard. At Garrett, we'd allied ourselves against the liberal theologies of Schleiermacher, Ritschl, and Harnack. One needed only look at what happened to the German churches during the Nazi era to see the dangers of identifying God with human actions. Barth's no answer to Emil Brunner on natural theology and his bold Barmen Declaration, 1934, made clear the dangers of a theology of culture. I was well aware of Getz's concern that God's power and human power are not the same. But I was thinking about God from the bottom and not the top, from the experience of the powerless black oppressed and not from that of the powerful white oppressor. God's power is found in human weakness, the struggle of the oppressed against their oppressors. It was clear to me that those who condemned black power were blind to the ideological dangers present in white evangelical, liberal, and neo-Orthodox theologies in America that either embraced or ignored the role of white supremacist ideals in their churches. This point was clear to me in my gut before I could articulate it with my mind. For most evangelicals, revelation was found in the inerrant scriptures, and one need not look elsewhere. I knew in my gut that God's revelation was found among poor black people. Though he disagreed with me, Ronald Getz could tell that I was dead serious, not engaging in theological hyperbole. He said, "If you believe that, Jim, why don't you say it publicly in writing and in a carefully worked-out argument?" He challenged me to give a public lecture on the theme of Christianity and Black Power at Elmhurst College, near Chicago, where he was teaching. I gladly accepted Getz's challenge because it was what I needed to organize my thoughts. He also gave me an audience where my thinking could be tested. Now I had to make an intelligent theological argument and not simply assert something because it was emotionally satisfying. I had to back up my claim with a thoughtful reflection. It was one thing to say simply that black power is the gospel, and quite another to make a credible theological argument for linking the two. No one, not even militant Negro ministers, had even thought about joining Black Power with Jesus. Their thinking was somewhat like that of Barth, who declared an infinite qualitative distinction between God and the human being. God is in heaven and we are on earth, Barth claimed, and any suggestion of a likeness between God and human beings is an anathema. No Negro preacher would dispute that assertion, and their congregations would follow suit. Yet Black Power advocates, following Malcolm X, rejected the Christian faith. Like Malcolm, they said, Christianity is the white man's religion. They saw Jesus as a blond, blue-eyed white man. Militant Negro ministers who wanted to embrace blackness struggled with how to reconcile Black Power and the gospel, Malcolm and Martin, self-defense and nonviolence, liberation and reconciliation. Faced with the choice of embracing blackness or Christian faith, a few preachers chose blackness, left the church, and joined the Nation of Islam or some other non-Christian black religion. Blackness spoke to the soul of black being in the world, and no one had articulated blackness better than Malcolm. "We are black first, and everything else is second," he had declared. Martin King, meanwhile, was uncomfortable with talk of blackness. He remained a Negro all his life and only reluctantly used the word black when pressured by black militants. He would not talk publicly or even privately with Malcolm, and he pleaded with Carmichael to stop talking about Black Power. King saw Black Power as alienating Negroes from whites, thereby making it impossible for the two communities to work together to create an integrated society. If I were going to demonstrate theologically that the message of Black Power is the message of Christ, I first had to define what I meant by Black Power and then by the message of Christ. To define Black Power, I turned first to Stokely Carmichael, its chief, best-known, and most controversial advocate. He was the public symbol of Black Power, and he had given many speeches on its meaning. He had also expanded on the theme in a book written with Charles V. Hamilton, a black professor of political science at Columbia University, Black Power, The Politics of Liberation. With the persuasive power of his rhetoric, Carmichael redefined the black struggle for justice, placing black self-determination at its center. The goal of black self-determination and black self-identity, Black Power, is full participation in the decision-making affecting the lives of black people and recognition of the virtues in themselves as black people. Who could disagree with that? Even more important than Carmichael for my thinking, however, was the work of other writers. Malcolm's Autobiography, 1965, James Baldwin's Nobody Knows My Name, 1961, and The Fire Next Time, 1963, Richard Wright's Native Son, 1940, and Black Boy, 1945, Albert Camus' The Plague, 1948, and The Rebel, 1956, and Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, 1966, and Black Skin, White Masks, 1967. These writers inspired me to do in theology what they did in literature. Far more important than any writer, though, was the black fire burning inside me and demanding expression. The spirit of blackness was driving me crazy in a good way, making me laugh and cry, walk and run, and even sing and dance as I listened to the sound and moved to the rhythm of Aretha's Respect and James Brown's Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. I began wearing dashikis, raised my Black Power fist, and adopted an Afro hairstyle so people could see that I was black. I began reading the young black poets like Leroy Jones's Amiri Baraka, Preface to a 20-volume Suicide Note, 1957, The Dead Lecturer, 1964, and Home, Social Essays, 1966, Don Lee's Haki Madhubuti, Black Pride, 1968, and Nikki Giovanni's Black Feeling, Black Talk, Black Judgment, 1968. I heard them read their poetry before they published. They were like traveling evangelists going from city to city all over the United States, giving poetic sermons, urging black people to think black, Don L. Lee, 1967, because we are bad people, Sonia Sanchez, 1970, The black poet Dudley Randall of Broadside Press, Detroit, published their poems in pamphlets and books, and churches and community centers provided a place for them to read their poetry. Their powerful verses turned me on, reminding me of the best in black preaching. They could make blackness sing and dance. People shouted, "Right on, sister! Say it, brother! Yeah, you talking!" I felt like I was in church, which I was, the Church of Blackness. I also went to hear the Reverend Albert Cleage preach a Black Power gospel at the Shrine of the Black Madonna in Detroit. He was the author of The Black Messiah, 1968, a book of sermons addressed to Black Power advocates trying to persuade them to stay in the church, with titles like An Epistle to Stokely and Brother Malcolm. He was the only preacher I heard who had the courage to be unashamedly and unapologetically black. I immersed myself in talk about black love, black unity and black pride, black liberation, and the black revolution. The meaning of black power was clear: the self-determination of black people in every area of their lives by any means they deemed necessary. No one outside of the black struggle for justice could tell us what we could and couldn't say or do to gain our freedom. Not even Negroes. I began to read the Bible through the lens of black power, black arts, and the black consciousness movement. A revolutionary Jesus leaped off the pages of Scripture into my mind, enabling me to see things I had not seen before. Luke's Jesus, citing the great prophet Isaiah, proclaimed, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." Chapter 4, verses 18 through 19, Revised Standard Version. Isaiah, chapter 61, verse 1. Luke's gospel was clear. Jesus' ministry was essentially liberation on behalf of the poor and the oppressed. I didn't need a doctorate in theology to know that liberation defined the heart of Jesus' ministry. Black people had been preaching and singing about it for centuries. When I turned away from white theology and back to Scripture and the black religious experience, the connection between black power and the gospel of Jesus became crystal clear. Both were concerned about the liberation of the oppressed. In fact, the actions, songs, and preaching of the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King Jr. as its central spokesperson expressed liberation in bus boycotts, sit-ins, marches, and freedom rides. King's civil rights movement was a liberation movement that challenged the American empire. The only thing missing in the Negro freedom struggle was the accent on blackness and the right of black people to assert their dignity without compromise. Negro churches, ministers, and activists rejected blackness because they did not want to alienate whites, who interpreted Christianity as universal, which for them, of course, meant white, and thus were opposed to the particularity of blackness, which they often identified with sin and evil, even the devil. But I contended that the gospel of Jesus is not opposed to blackness. On the contrary, Christ is black, that is, identified with the black struggle for justice and dignity. I became intellectually comfortable writing about Jesus' gospel without needing the support of white biblical scholars and systematic theologians to validate my perspective. Reading them took me away from the biblical Jesus to a white Jesus of their creation. I remembered sitting in New Testament classes at Garrett where professors presented Jesus as a white man. How could Jesus be white, since he was born a Jew in Palestine under a very hot sun, as James Baldwin reminded the World Council of Churches? It made no sense to anyone who knew anything about the Middle East. The real historical Jesus, whom scholars have been seeking since the 18th century, was not white. That much I knew. When it became clear to me that Jesus was not biologically white and that white scholars actually lied by not telling people who he really was, I stopped trusting anything they said. It was ideologically tainted. I began to trust my own black experience as a better source for knowledge about God and Jesus. The black religious experience was less ideologically tainted because blacks were powerless and could not impose their views of Jesus on anybody. But often blacks mistrusted their own experience, turned instead to whites for their values, using the same white portraits of Jesus in their homes and in the stained glass windows in their churches.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?